There, that looks like it's working. Hopefully the internet connection will work well for the evening. It's sometimes touch and go in down East Maine. But I'm going to talk about my work on the wildflowers of Maine islands. And they are extraordinary islands when you think about the plants, the animals, the seaweeds that are out on these islands. So I'm going to start by giving you some numbers, and then we'll move into the talk. So there's around 5,000 islands on the coast of Maine. And it's actually hard to count. It depends upon your definition of an island. There's just so many that it's hard to get an accurate count. There's so many. And on those islands, we've got plant species lists for about 300 of them. So it's a drop in the bucket of the 5,000 islands on the coast, but it's a start. And we're starting to figure out something about the wildflowers found on these extraordinary habitats. And you know, there's roughly a little over 1,000 species that have been found on these islands. So that's half of the flora. So I'm going to start by talking about my work on the islands, a little bit about the ecology of the species, the plants out on islands, and talk about some new developments in our research and how things have changed. So all this work has been done through Maine Natural History Observatory. We're a small nonprofit. I'm the director. And we specialize in building baseline data sets for important habitats on the coast in Maine, throughout all of Maine. And pretty much all of our work these days is building these data sets. I consider us working for the next generation of Maine biologists. So encourage you to check out our website, mainenaturalhistory.org, and see some of the other projects that we're working on. So I was contemplating how to start out this talk. There's a lot of different ways I could do that. And I decided I'd start by making some bold statements. And then we'll back up a little bit and fill in the pieces for you. So the bold statements I'm going to make, you know, I've been working out on the islands for 30 years or so, looking at plants. And I'm starting to figure out, it's taken that long, but I'm starting to figure out something about the ecology of these island habitats. So I'm gonna give you 4 drivers of what affects the species of plants that you find on islands. And I'm going to do it in opposite order from least important, and we'll work our way up to the most important thing. So we'll start with number 1, what I'm considering the least important out of the 4. And some of you who know something about island biogeography may be surprised by this, but I consider island biogeography to be lowest on the list. And what island biogeography is, it's trying to figure out, you know, how plants, you know, the number of plants or the number of species that you find on islands. And pretty much the bigger the island, you would expect more species to be on a bigger island than a smaller island. And the further offshore an island is, you know, the more isolated it is, you expect fewer species. So this clearly plays a role in plants on islands in Maine. But I think there's other things that actually play a bigger role. So we'll move up on the list a little. List, I say, is human history on the islands. Some islands have a lot of human history. This is Matinicus Rock. It's in outer Penobscot Bay, has a lighthouse on it, and it has a long history of people being out there and people hauling materials and living out there and having having animals for food out there. And so that really can affect the plants that we see now on these islands. So we'll move up to the second most important driver of what we see plant-wise on the island. And it has to do with the grazers. Actually, it's the history of grazers on the island. There's most islands on the coast of Maine had sheep at one point in its history. Not as much anymore. So the topic you can just about just based on how grazers affect on veg that we see. So I'm going to gloss over this, but it is an important aspect of the plants that we see now on the islands, particularly those islands that had grazers in the past that don't currently. So now you may be wondering, I've gone through 3 of these, and we still haven't hit on the most important, what I'm considering the most important thing driving the plants that I see on islands. So you might be curious what's left. And it's ocean currents, actually. And this will take a little bit of explanation. So this is, Gulf of Maine, Bay of Fundy, that's Nova Scotia, and the coast of Maine, Mount Desert Island, Penobscot Bay, Cape Cod. So in the greater Gulf of Maine, we've got a cold water current that wraps in around Nova Scotia and gets stirred up in the huge tides of the Bay of Fundy. And we get a cold water current that gets driven to the surface by some shallow waters around Grand Manan. And it flows along the coast and starts to dissipate. By the time you get to Schoodic, Mount Desert Island, by the time you hit Penobscot Bay, it kind of collapses altogether. And this is a huge driver of the plants that we see on islands. And I'll explain more about this as we go on. So this is a sea surface temperature. It's from 2016. I haven't pulled a more recent one than that, but it shows Maine, Gulf of Maine, and the sea surface temperatures in June. So the purple areas are the coldest water surface temperature. And you can see that, we get our coldest waters really get stirred up in the Bay of Fundy. A lot of cold water is driven to the surface around Grand Manan Island and dissipating, as I was describing, by Mount Desert Island and kind of collapsing by Penobscot Bay. Now this drives the distribution of a lot of plants on the coast. And one of the main reasons is fog. If you take cold water, surface water, along the down east coast, and you add a warm air mass above it, that's a perfect recipe for fog. And I actually, I look for those days when it's supposed to be really hot on the mainland, and I make sure I head off out on the islands, especially on the down east coast, because it's likely to be a fog whole day. So I've spent many a day botanizing in a sweater in these habitats. It can be cool out there, thick fog, not that much sun. If you're walking through the vegetation, it's all wet. It's condensing fog and it's dripping onto the soil. So when you think about that, the plants in the mainland, that's a really stressful day for them, that they've got really hot temperatures, water stress and whatnot. And you think of these plants on the islands, and this is a great growing day for them. And so the habitat mimics more northerly areas. So you get some more northern Arctic plants keying in on that habitat. So I'll describe, some of our work on these islands. That we have a sailboat. This is our research boat. It's a 21-foot open skiff sailboat. Like to minimize our carbon footprint. I also like to sail. And I pitch a tent on the boat so I can go out for multiple days. This is a really seaworthy boat for a small one. I can get it into shallow areas, row ashore, do some work on islands, a full day work on the islands, and come back and spend the night in the boat. Go to another island the next day. And what I do when I'm on the islands, it's actually changed over the years. So when we first, long time ago now, we'd go to an island, we'd make 3 or 4 trips to an island to try to figure out what plants grew there. And we'd make 3 or 4 trips because we'd want to do one early in the season, like in June, to figure out the early flowering species that were showing up. We do July and August trip because they were trying to figure out abundance as well of plants, and that can change from month to month. And do a September trip because there's a whole suite of late flowering things that you wouldn't detect earlier in the season. And what we used to do is make a list of the plants that we'd find on an island, and that was it. You know, we thought I needed to visit maybe 25 islands or so, and I'd kind of get the flora of Maine figured out. It would all start to make sense then, which didn't turn out to be true. It's really quite complex, the flora that you see on islands.
Glenn, we're having some trouble hearing you once in a while. I don't know if you want to maybe try shutting your video off.
Yep, I will try that, and hopefully that'll work a little better for folks. So the other thing that we've done over the years is I take a lot of photos of plants when we're out on islands, and that's to help photo document some of the species that we're running across, but also you can learn a lot by looking at photographs. Magnification is a great thing, and so I take photographs of a lot of plants, and I get back in my office and look at them, and often I can pick up features that I've missed in the field. So we're developing a photo library that, you know, can help us and help others with how to identify some of these plants. So I'm going to go through and talk some of the plants we find on a lot of islands, the common to occasional plants that we find. So there's mouse ear, chickweeds are really quite common on the islands. There's 2 species, Cerastium fontanum, which is mouse ear chickweed. It's the non-native species. There's a native field chickweed found again on most islands. If you're just new to trying to figure out these plants, an easy way to tell them apart is you look at the petal length in relation to the sepal length, that green leaf-like thing behind the petals. In the non-native plant, they're roughly the same size. If you look at maybe that flower for the native plant, and the petals are much longer. There's a whole bunch of other characters on how to tell these plants apart. And like most plants, it takes experience. You get to know a plant and its variation, and then you can start to recognize them when they aren't in flower. You can start to recognize them when they're in, you know, seedling stage. Some of these. So these 2 species are both in the Apiaceae family, are common. They're found on most islands. Seaside angelica here on the left, Scotch lovage. I've run into folks who have trouble telling these apart. And there's one really easy way to figure it out. If you look at Scotch lovage and look down at the base of the main stems, they're really quite bright red. And even on some of the nodes, you can get that bright red color. And if you look at Seaside Angelica, you may get some reddish or pinkish color moving in, but it's really diffuse, not that bright red that you see in Scotch lovage. Now, I'm rather fond of the eyebrights, and there's 4 species of eyebright or so out on the islands, maybe 5. Common eyebright, found on most islands, occurs in a variety of habitats, and I'm particularly fond of Rand's eyebright. It often forms dense patches along the shoreline, particularly on the down east coast. So when I start talking down east coast, you can think, oh, that's probably tied to that cold water current that happens. So the flowers of this Rand's eyebright are much smaller. In a sense, the inside petals are roughly the same looking. It's a smaller flower. The top of the petal, the hood over the flower is much pinker, redder in Rand's eyebright. And this one, it's most common on the down east coast. By the time you get southwest of Penobscot Bay, you really don't run into that species. So most of you are probably familiar with irises. So likely this species, the blue iris, it's found all across Maine. It's found out on the islands quite commonly. But there's also an Arctic species, the beach-head iris, that's also found on the islands. Again, it's tied to the down east coast. So you can think, yeah, tied to that cold water current. The way you tell these apart is that this blue iris has 6 tepals. 3 of them are large petal-like things, and 3 of them, the outer ones, are smaller, but they're still quite large. You look at beach-head iris, it has the large petals, and the outer ones are much smaller. So if you're just learning how to identify that plant, that's the character to key in on. There's other things, and once you get to know the plant a little better, there are field characters you can use to identify it if it isn't in flower. I'm rather fond of bird's eye. It doesn't like the competition of other plants, but you find it on the islands a fair bit, growing right close to the shoreline, especially if there's a little seep. It likes a little moisture, but not other plants nearby. And this is it in its full blooming glory. It doesn't really have petals. But once you get to know this, an inch tall, maybe inch and a half tall, you'll start to recognize it in other places. I see it growing in the cracks in the sidewalk when I go to the grocery store and the post office. So there aren't a whole lot of plants competing for that space. Plus there's probably salt being applied as well. This is a salt tolerant plant. It does well there. And I smile when I see it in urban settings. And seaside plantain, it's a wildflower. It looks more grass, but it's just not very showy. It's an edible plant. It's sold in markets over in Europe. Hasn't caught on this side of the pond, but when I'm out botanizing, I often grab a couple of leaves to add to my lunch. It's a tasty little plant, fairly common on all the islands. So now we'll get down to talking about some of the uncommon to rare plants on islands. So bird's eye primrose, I love this plant. It's uncommon. It can get to a foot tall or so. It can also be a lot shorter, 5 inches. It grows on the shore, tied to the down east islands, tied to that cold water current, where places where you find it. It also interestingly shows up around lighthouses. I think it's the lime leaching out of the cement is something this plant really enjoys, does well with. Rose root's another gorgeous plant. It's a succulent, found most commonly on the down east coast. It's a medicinal plant. It's more used over in Europe and Russia than in North America. But there's some research on its medicinal properties. It's a fun one to run across on the islands, as well as seaside bluebells. It's a short, squat, sprawly plant that is found on gravel beaches. And the further east you go, the happier it is. So again, it's tied to that, that cold habitat. Down near Mount Desert Island, if you see this species, the plant doesn't look very happy. It's not big and sprawling. Cross Island, which is on the extreme eastern coast of Maine, a lot of cobble beach patches, very happy down there. And marsh fellwort is a fairly rare plant. It only grows on a few islands, the down east coast area. It's surprising how hard it is to see this plant. These photos make it look kind of showy. And yeah, it's short. It's 3 or 4 inches tall. But there's something about this plant that's just hard to find. I found a new population of this on an island, I believe it was last year. And I was going back to that island a few weeks later. It's a very late flowering species, so it was in September. And as I was walking down the shoreline, I decided to look for it again because I knew I found it in a couple patches, and I couldn't find it again. And I'm sure it's there. It's just it likes it. It really easily blends in. And an interesting species that we picked up recently in outer Penobscot Bay is this non-native Spanish stonecrop. It's a succulent. There were botanists on these islands where I found this in the 70s and 80s, and they never reported this plant. So it seems to be have moved in recently, and we're still getting a handle on what it's going to do on Maine islands. So now I want to talk a little bit. We've gone over some of the plants that you find on islands, common plants, rare plants, and some of the reasons that they're found on these islands. Now we're going to talk a little bit on how do they get out there. The islands are isolated, surrounded by water. So how do plants colonize these habitats? The first thing to remember is most of the Maine islands weren't always islands. The coast of Maine was under a lot of ice in the past. When that receded, the seawater level wasn't always at that level. It's changed quite a bit. And a lot of these islands, not all of them, but a lot of them were connected to the mainland at one point. So the plants we find on islands today be left over from the connections to the mainland. But there's other ways, avenues that plants take to get out to some of these isolated islands. And there's a couple of brilliant studies researching this on more isolated islands than we find on the coast of Maine. And they find that plants get out to the islands by drifting up on the ocean, blowing out on the wind, and brought by other animals like birds. And the same thing certainly happens on the coast of Maine. Things float up on islands. Even things that don't float get pushed up on islands. This is Hart Island on Muscongas Bay. I haven't seen that many traps washed up on an island before. And they don't even float. But there's a lot of logs and stuff that do float, and they can transport plants. So here's a piece of driftwood with plants growing out of it. Now maybe a storm's going to come and haul this thing off the shoreline and push it up on another island, and might bring some plants with it. So I've actually seen some of this in my work. I've run across a species of plant on an island, and it's kind of the only individual I find is growing out of a piece of driftwood, suggesting that it washed up on the island. So sea rocket is a species that uses the ocean to transport its seeds. The seeds float. The plant grows really close to the water, so that on the highest tides and during storms, the plants are getting washed around. The seeds float and survive, emerge salt water for a long time, wash up on another shore, and start growing. But it's not just seeds that can transplant plants. The sea beach sandwort grows down near the water as well on islands and cobbly areas, and its stems are really brittle. So if it starts getting washed by waves, this off and float up on another island and start growing again. So plants can also move out to islands by the seeds drifting on the wind. And seeds can go a long ways. Even it's thought that some plants were transported out to the Hawaiian Islands by the air. That's quite a trip for a seed. But there's some that they're well designed for it, like the dandelion. A long, lightweight stalk, and then a big foofy thing at the top. It can blow a long ways in the wind and get transported to new sites. So fireweed is another species that does the same thing. This is the developing seed pod behind the flower. As that ripens, it splits open, and all the seeds have big floofy things on them to drift around on the wind to new islands, maybe. But if you think about it, there's actually a great study in British Columbia, I think it was, that looked at these wind dispersed seeds on island plants. And it's a great way to get to an island if you're a species. You get a seed blown in. That's a brilliant way to make it happen. But then that plant growing on the island, if it's a small island, if you've got seeds that are well developed to blow around in the wind, most of them are probably going to blow off the island and into the water. And so this study in British Columbia found that the mainland population of a species, they had a much bigger floofs on the end of their seeds for wind transport. But once the species got to the island, there was selection for much reduced plumes on their seeds, so that they don't get blown off the island, and the species can persist on the island. So birds and other animals transport plants as well out on islands. So gulls, they move vegetation around, although generally not very far when they're building their nests. Cormorants move vegetation around. They bring in vegetation to build their stick nest. And I've seen them flying long distances with veg. And actually, I was working on an island off of Eastport and found that an invasive plant had taken over a cormorant colony. And we think what happened is a cormorant brought in a stick from an invasive plant that then sprouted, took over the colony, and kind of choked out the cormorants from their nesting site. We've been working on removing that invasive plant, and the cormorants are nesting back on that island again. There are also, when you think of bird guano, fertilizer, that plants must like it, but there can be too much of a good thing. Cormorant guano basically kills all the plants, although I guess not some invasive plants. It's just so strong, it just wipes everything out. But there are some plants that are kind of tied to being able to withstand, live in that high guano area, like common stitchwort. So birds can also, like during fall migration, songbirds can, frugivores, eat seeds, small seeded fruits on the mainland and come out to the islands during migration and poop out the seeds that they collected up during their migration out on the island. And so definitely there's plants take advantage of that are now found on the islands because of bird migration, like red elderberry. It's bird dispersed. It's found on a fair number of islands. It's thought that large cranberry is also bird dispersed. I'm not sure about that. It's funny, on some islands, others I don't, so I don't know, I'm still figuring that one out. But when we talk about animals moving things around on islands, we got to get back to people. A lot of human history on the islands. You picnic on an island, you go explore. As soon as you start hauling building materials to build a fishing shack or something, a lot of this has happened in the history of the Maine coast. As soon as you start transporting things, seeds and plant fragments tend to come with. And that's definitely a vector for how plants end up on islands. Common burdocks, the seeds adhere to everything. That basically, when I'm field work and I finish up for the day on an island, I spend the time to empty the seeds out of my boots and pick the burdock seeds and other seeds off my sweater, wash some of my gear before going into the boat to try to minimize the plants that I'm moving around on islands during my work. So I thought I'd touch on now this question of whether or not all islands have more or less the same plants. It's kind of getting at what I thought was the case when I started this research, that you just figure out the flora on a couple dozen islands and you'd have it figured out, which isn't the case. But I thought I'd illustrate this by looking at 5 islands that I've worked on a bunch of years ago now on the eastern coast. So they range from Inner Sand Island, which is the furthest east, so closer to that cold water current, up to Egg Rock. So let's look at the floras of these 5 islands and see how they differ. So Inner Sand Island, that's the easternmost island of the group. 18 acres, it's roughly 3 miles to the nearest mainland. The interesting thing about this island, it has little to no human history on it. It's actually a semi-challenging island to land on. It can definitely be done, but if you start to get any sea running, it becomes a real challenge to get onto this island. And so if you're looking for an island to put sheep on historically, or put a fishing shack on, this wouldn't be the first choice out here. There's other islands nearby that would work much better for that. So really there's not a whole lot of human history out on this island. It's got a variety of habitats, some field, and some forest on this island, and a pretty low percent of non-native species, 18%, which is pretty low for the coast of Maine. 127 species of plants out here, including a couple of rarities. So that, oh, and these islands, I've ordered them in terms of the percent of non-natives in the flora. So we're moving up now, as we're already jumped to 34% non-native on Eastern Island. It's a small island, 3 acres. I'm not sure of the human history because it's kind of a small island. It's near the mainland, 58 species of plants, you know, but a high percentage of non-natives. Petit Manan Island, it's an offshore island, house, so think, you know, major human history of people on that island. 98 species, we're already up to 35% of the flora out there is non-native. Jordan's Delight, it's a wonderful island off the Millbridge, Addison area of the coast. 27 acres, some interesting habitats and cliffs on this island, but it's got some human history of occupation out there. 122 species of plants, we're already up to 39% of those are non-natives. And the last one is it's the furthest west. It's also tucked up into Frenchman's Bay a little bit. It's got a lighthouse on it, so think, you know, a lot of human influence, and 43% non-natives. It's actually a lot of the islands a monoculture of not that many species. The diversity you find is on the shoreline, not in the interior on this island. 56 plant species, not a whole lot there either. So I want to switch now to talking about change on islands. You know, I enjoy, there's a couple of plants on the coast that I just love seeing. You know, I've been out on these islands looking at plants for a number of years now, and I'm noticing change in my lifetime. And I expect, you know, there's going to be some major change still happening in the future. And I think people really don't like seeing change in their lifetime. But let's step back a little bit. You know, yeah, I'll be sad to see change happening on these islands in my lifetime. And I've seen some of that. But when you think about the ecosystem of plants on islands, change is a huge part of what happens all the time. Things are constantly changing. So at the ecosystem level, the community level, you know, change isn't something new. And it's just hard for us to see that in our lifetime. But one thing about change is we know the Gulf of Maine is warming fast, and we're going to see changes of the islands coming up in the next 50 to 100 years. And so that's changed how we do some of our field work. I talked about just building species lists. Early on when I was working on islands, we just make a species list for an island like Halifax Island. It's off of Rope Bluffs, so on the East Coast. Gorgeous island. But when you think about, you know, we're working, a lot of the work I do at Maine Natural History Observatory, I consider that we're working for the next generation of Maine biologists. And we got to give them these data sets where they can start, they can have a data set where they can start to figure out change that's happening that happened from now to then. And so they can actually do some predictions on change that they're going to see as well. So in thinking about that, we've changed how we do fieldwork quite a bit. So how we do it now is we build a virtual grid over the island. So it's a grid system that I load onto a handheld GPS when I'm out in the field. So I don't put anything down in the field on these islands. I just look at my GPS and wander systematically through each grid cell. And in each grid cell, I make a list of plants that I see, as well as the categorical abundance. And again, we make multiple trips over a year, visiting each grid cell on each trip, to try to get a really good baseline data set for each grid cell on an island. Now, when you think about that, at the end of the field season, we can build distribution maps for every species on that island. So this is a species of cotton grass. It grows in wetlands, and there's 3 wetland islands. And since we record the categorical abundance of each species in each grid cell, we can say, oh, well, it's common in 3 patches here. So those are the wetland, and occasionally, it's found in more places. There's even an isolated, must be a small wetland over in here where it's picked up. So what I like about this is it gives you a lot of metrics for that, thinking of that next generation of Maine biologists, 25, 50 years from now, redoing this study. They can look at whether or not cotton grass grows in this grid cell 25, 50 years from now. They could look at it at a different spatial scale and say, well, is it still found in the 3 wetlands, or have the wetlands changed enough where, it's only found in this one maybe and not these 2. But also, even at another spatial scale, you could say, well, maybe this species is disappearing from this island, 25, 50 years from now, but what's it doing on another island that's nearby that we have good data on? So what I like about this method is there's a lot of metrics for comparison at different spatial scales. So I talked about sea rocket earlier on. It's a plant that's tied to the shorelines of islands, and it's found in a couple of places on Halifax Island. It's uncommon on this shoreline here. There's a whole section here where you don't find any stems. There's the densest pocket is in this little spit on the island. So I really like this as a metric, although we did it for a couple of years and felt that we could do a little better. I felt like we were missing a little better quantitative data, that these categories are a little subjective. And also, the most interesting zone is along the shoreline, where it goes from absolutely no plants on the shoreline. You get a line where the plants start. Sometimes it's very sharp, sometimes it's not. It's diffuse, to the interior. So we actually set up some belt transects on our islands and ran quadrats. Belt transects on the shoreline as well as in the interior. If the island's small enough, we did this on every grid cell. Larger islands, we'd start to pick a subset of grid cells where we could, pull this data. And again, it's to help build a better baseline data set for change that we know is going to come in the future with plants on Maine islands. So another thing that we like in History Observatory is building field guides. That knowing the plants of Maine doesn't need to be restricted to botanists. There's there's a long history that amateurs can do amazing things with, plant research and seaweed research and lots of things. They just need some tools to help, get them started. And so we pulled together this Wildflowers of Maine Islands field guide as a tool to help folks who are learning island plants. But also what I really like about field guides like this is it sets down what we currently know about islands on the coast about plants on islands in Maine. So, we have species lists for around 300 islands. There's 5,000 islands on the coast. So we don't know everything about plants on islands, but this field guide helps to set down what we currently know. And so everyone, if they find a plant on an island, they can look it up in this field guide and see if maybe it's a new record of a plant on an island. So I like that it sets down a marker of our current knowledge of plants on islands. But it's also, this field guide is organized so that plants that are similar looking are grouped together in the guide. And we've developed some pretty simple keys to help you figure out an unknown plant. So maybe you're wandering around in an island and you come across this thing and you think, well, wonder what that is. Almost looks orchid-like. Maybe you know that, maybe you don't. But we tried to develop a really simple key where pretty quickly you could get to the pages in the guide to start looking at pictures to see if you can see something that looks like that. So there's a master key that takes you to 3 different tables. And whether or not there's any leaves, the arrangement of the leaves on the stem. So looks like there's a leaf down there at the base. So let's call that basal leaves only. And that's this table here at the bottom. Plants with no leaves or leaves only at the base of the plant. So then what we need to do is look at 3 different things, 2 things about the leaf and 1 thing about the flowers to figure out what pages to look at. So leaf type, is it simple or divided? And this is, it looks like a very thin spoon. So yeah, it's a simple leaf. It doesn't have lobes on it. So the leaf or leaflet margin, is it smooth, entire, or does it have teeth or big lobes on it? Looks smooth to me. So now we're in this section of the table, and we want to know something about the flowers, the symmetry and flower color. So the first question is whether or not it's bilateral or radial. And bilateral means there's kind of one plane where you can cut it in half, that flower in half, and you've got a mirror image. That's bilateral. That's what this plant is. Think of it like the spokes of a wheel, a bicycle. You can kind of, there's lots of different places where you could divide it and it would still show mirror images. So this is a bilateral flower and it's pink to purple to yellow. So pretty quickly we've got down to 2 pages in the guide that we should go look at. And these are those 2 pages. Now a quick glance and we think, oh, it kind of looks like that. Dragon's mouth, Arethusa bulbosa. It's very rare on islands. It's only picked up on 3 islands. They're kind of larger ones in Washington County. That was pretty quick to identify a plant. There's people who confuse grass dragon's mouth, but the flower really looks. But the other thing that we do in this guide is have at the end of this page or a group of pages that you key to, we have a little safety net built in. So we say, you might come to this set of pages, but the species is actually described elsewhere in the guide. So, it kind of looks closer to this rose begonia than it does to grass pink. So, but no, it looks like that. So we do have that safety net built into the guide, which I really like for, to help you arrive at the proper identification of an unknown plant. So I've been talking for a while. I see my connection has been unstable occasionally. Hopefully it's been good enough where you could hear stuff. I'd encourage you to be a member of Maine Natural History Observatory and check out what we're doing, help to support this work. There's a lot of projects that we work on. It's not just plants. There's a lot of really cool projects. And again, a lot of them, we're really focused in on setting the baseline data set, of current conditions for a lot of different taxa in Maine, so that the next generation of biologists will have some data sets where they can start to look for change that's happened. So this isn't very glamorous research. It's tough to fund this kind of research, but it's the niche that we've worked in at Maine Natural History Observatory that we think is so important that we're happy to put in the time and do these projects, even with just a little bit of funding. We really feel strongly that the work that we're doing is really quite important. And if you become a member, you can actually get a copy of the Wildflowers of Maine Islands if you become a member at the $75 level. And it asks when you're on and you're filling out information, it asks for how you heard about Maine Natural History Observatory. And if you want me to sign that copy, you can just put a note in the how you heard about us field. You can type in, please sign the copy. We'd be happy to sign it and mail it out to you as well. And with that, I've been chatting for a while. I think I'll stop and see if there's any questions that folks have.
We do have one in the chat here that says, are you going to be building guides to flora south of the current guide, for example, Penobscot Bay Islands?
Yeah, the field guide does cover Penobscot Bay. So it covers from the Canadian border through to Muscungus Bay, so kind of Pemaquid Point area. And the reason it doesn't cover the whole coast is the island flora really changes down in the southern area, the southern portion of Maine coast. And it's not an area where I've done a ton of field work. And so I didn't feel like I knew that flora well enough to put it in the guide. So we've limited it to the eastern 2/3 of the state.
We got another question here from Andrew. How does one get to have your job?
That's a simple one. You have to be willing to work long hours for little to no pay. And yeah, I so enjoy my work that it makes it easier to put in the long hours. And I feel so strongly about the work that we do that it doesn't matter that we find it a tough time to raise money to do everything we want to do on the coast, but we work a lot of long hours, put in a lot of volunteer time to do some, I think, pretty amazing things. And especially, I think our work is going to see its value in another 25, 50 years from now.
We have another question from Peter asking about mosses and lichens and trees.
Yeah. Yeah, we've currently switched to working on seaweeds. And so seaweeds are really interesting on the coast because there is no species list for what species are found in Maine. And there's rare seaweeds, there's invasive seaweeds. And again, when you think about the change that's happening in the Gulf of Maine, we just think that's the next thing that we really need to get into to start to build the species list for the state. And we also want to build a field guide to help open it up so that more of us can be out studying Maine seaweeds and help to set a baseline. So that has our attention right now. So I don't see us branching into mosses and lichens anytime soon. There are some really good tree guides already for the region. So we likely won't dive into that that quickly. However, when you get into shrubs are complex. So we've thought for a while that it would be interesting to do a shrub guide. Woody plants. We don't have that on our radar yet, just not enough time in the day.
We have someone wondering if there's an ETA on the field guide for seaweeds.
Yeah, we're just starting that work. We're a year and a half into it. Our focus now is really building the database that can help us track species lists and distribution. Just compiling the existing information, trying to get it all in one place. What do we know based on all the work that's been done on seaweeds on the Maine coast? We're just starting to delve into building the first species pages of the guide. We hope to release a simple guide to a few common species, maybe later this year. It'll be on the Maine Natural History Observatory website. And that's more as a concept to help us fund the larger project. So I could see us taking another 5 to 10 years until we're going to have our seaweed guide ready to publish on the Maine coast. It takes a lot of time to compile this stuff and to build the photo library that you can put into a field guide. So it's not a simple project. So it'll take us a little bit of time.
Awesome. Caroline is wondering if you could talk about the opportunities for citizen science in the collection of baseline data.
Yeah, there's a long history of amateurs doing a lot of great work, citizen science, helping to do things like this, build baseline data sets. And we're slowly trying to, at the observatory, build more of this into our programs. Right now, it's more on the bird front, some bird monitoring projects that we get citizen science involvement on. Plants, we don't have programs set up yet. Seaweeds, we're actually looking for folks to help build out our photo library. But, for plants, in a sense, anyone can, maybe there's an island that you go to a lot, and happy to send you the tools where you could start to figure out the plants on the island. It's a great way to learn the plants, is to go to an island and say, I'm going to figure out what grows here and make a list, or even document where on the island something's found. And some of the field guides we've used can be great tools to help you do that. And there's also there's a lot of great botanists in Maine that are willing to help people starting out. So if you run across things that you don't know, there's people that you can send folks, that you can send pictures to of stuff you're confused on, and they're quite happy to help along that front.
All right, we'll do one more question here and then we'll get wrapped up. Emily is wondering about when walking along the grid map on the islands, how do you determine if a particular species is common, uncommon, or rare?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a bit subjective. So if we talk about the extremes, you know, when I document something as rare, it's a small clump or two in this the grid cell. My grid cells are 30 meters by 30 meters, so about 90 feet on a side. And on the other extreme of that, something that's common, found roughly, you know, large patches covering, you know, at least a third of the grid cell or so. So the extremes are kind of easier to figure out, two ends. And then we use an uncommon and an occasional category in between those that are just kind of more than a couple clumps, but not that many. We, you know, call uncommon, you know, really quite widespread, but not getting to the covering a third of the square. We use the occasional category, but that is subjective.